Hello, everybody. My name is Joey Paxman. I'm an editor for the independent publisher PM Press. PM Press, we are the proud publisher of Richard Manning's new book, If It Sounds Good, It Is Good, which can be found here in town at Fact and Fiction. It can also be found at pmpress.org. So I'm just going to give Dick a real quick introduction here, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we met and how we came to publish this book. So I think most people already know Dick Manning. He is a Missoula resident, a lifelong journalist, author of about a dozen books, I think, contributing editor for Harper's Magazine. He was a John S. Knight Fellow in Journalism at Stanford University. He's received countless awards, especially in environmental journalism. His excellent book, One Round River, which is about the Blackfoot, was named a significant book of the year by the New York Times. So I met Dick about 2 years ago. He and David James Duncan were doing a reading at the Cider House here in town. It was the Camas kind of year-end party that they do. It was a nice, small, sort of intimate setting, and afterwards, everybody just hung out and drank and ate good food and talked. Now, I don't consider myself to be the kind of fanboy who goes, searching for, someone to sign my book, but I'm a lifelong fan of Manning's work. I've read all of his books, most of them 2-3 times. So I thought, you know what the hell? I'm just gonna introduce myself, say hi, and tell him I'm a fan. Now, anytime that I have the opportunity to meet a musician or a visual artist, or especially a writer who I admire, and if they happen to be, a writer that's really made it, as in, they've published a dozen books, sold hundreds of thousands of copies, won prestigious awards, I'm always very curious to ask, are you sitting right now, on a manuscript that's as good as anything you've ever written, but maybe it's the book that you really wanted to write, knowing that perhaps it doesn't necessarily have an appeal to New York. It doesn't fit into their economic model for what's profitable, what's marketable. And now there's an important distinction. I'm not talking about a B-sides, right? So say a musician writes 100 songs and 12 of those songs make it onto the record, right? 88 songs maybe weren't so good. I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about the songs or the books that are just as good as anything you'd ever written. But New York's not gonna maybe be that interested in it. The reason I'm interested in this question is that, we're all very painfully aware that book publishing, newspapers, journals, everything is shrinking year after year. I mean, hell, it's been shrinking for longer than I've been alive. The companies that do make it, they're increasingly bought up by the so-called big five. There's 5 publishers that own 80% of all publishing. Now, of course, that has political, cultural, social implications that we won't necessarily go into here. But it's important because, we think of books kind of as these vessels of free thought, of ideas. Well, what does it mean when literally 5 companies control the production, the distribution, and ultimately the consumption of these ideas? So anyways, I happened to ask Dick this question, if he's got this man, and it happened that he did. Now, to be sure, he had this manuscript and tons of publishers actually were interested in it, but Dick told me it was very important to find the right publisher, the publisher who gets it, the publisher who's willing to stand by it. Anyways, and that's how PM Press came to publish this book. So, Dick, before I turn it over to you, I'd actually just like to ask you a question. You have said that it really ultimately was a guitar, literally a guitar, a vintage Gibson, if I'm correct, that took you on this journey through the history of American music. I mean, American history, human history, social, biological evolution. It took you on this journey that got you, to write this book. So maybe you can just tell us a little bit about the book, and maybe even discuss this guitar and how exactly it did take you on this journey.
Well, thank you, Joy, and thanks for that wonderful introduction. I mean, it's really good to be here at the Festival of the Book because it allows us to talk about these background issues in publishing and writing, which I think are vital, um, as opposed to flogging books, which we're supposed to do in these kinds of things. So I'm happy to do this, and I'm glad you got us into the nitty gritty of the publishing world right off the bat. And the guitar's a really good way to talk about that. I love guitars. I have all my life. This particular one I discovered during the process of writing this book and researching the book. And it was a mess. It was a basket case, but it was a vintage Gibson guitar from 1949. And I discovered it through a friend of mine, and another friend of mine spent a year rebuilding it. And that whole process to me came to represent what I was doing, which is researching history and talk about rebuilding music and our commitment to music in some ways, which never got torn apart for me. I'm still part of it. But that very guitar is on the cover of the book. It's the one you're looking at when you hold up the cover of the book, and it's sitting about 8 feet away from me as we're talking right now. It's never very far away. But let me get into the implications of that, but why this guitar will take you very rapidly into this story is because as I was resurrecting it and coming to understand it, of course, I researched the model itself, and I knew something about it when I bought it. But I really came to know it, and it's a 1949 Gibson Southern Jumbo, which just happened to be the model that Woody Guthrie played. And it just happened to be the model with his very famous photograph of him, of the guitar, painted on the face of it, "This machine kills fascists." And I started shaking when I realized I'm holding the same thing. It was like 2 years older or newer than Woody's guitar, but same deal. And to me, it was important because this story becomes instantly political. And you cannot trace American music without getting wound up in things that are subversive. Questions about racism, especially, and the book did that. We're into racism in a very big way, to the point that I'm surprised at how relevant it is now, 5 years after beginning it, to current day conversations about race and about inclusion and about who we are as Americans. So it was a fascinating way to get into a book, and I always have some totem like that will pull me through a story. This one very much pulled me through the story and continues to pull me through life to this day. So it was an interesting part of that. I want to get to another question because I'm going to tell a story you don't know. And as a matter of fact, when the backdrop to that conversation we had, which you described very well, and you ask in that a rhetorical question, what difference does it make to us if 5 or 6 publishing companies control everything that we publish? And the very reason I was looking around for a publisher like PM Press is and all my books flow from the last book, the book before and the book before that, and this one is no exception. But when I did Go Wild, which was my book before, I published with Little Brown, and Little Brown is one of the companies you're talking about, controlled by Hachette, which is the mega publisher now, and with its thumb on the publishing industry. And I even hate to call it an industry; it's more sacred than that. But as I wrote that book, I wrote it with a co-author, which I'd not done before. And I did my duty as a journalist. And one of the chapters, and it's about evolution and human well-being, how we take care of ourselves. And one of the chapters I wrote in there were about the social implications and political implications of that idea. And it was a chapter that became political because I talked about conservatives and what they failed to do in regarding this idea. And I talked about liberals and what they failed to do in this idea. And during the editing process, I got a call from an editor saying, we got to cut that chapter. I said, why? That's a good chapter. And that was the last I heard of it. And then my editor on the project met with my co-author, unknown to me, and they cut that chapter. And I asked them why, and they said, well, if it's allowed to stand, conservative people will go on Amazon and write a negative review And if that happens, it will hurt sales, period. They said there is no point, there's no place for a political discussion in a book. And this was at a time when I could think of no better place for a political discussion than a book. If we cannot do politics in books, then we are lost. And if we worry about our marketing plan ahead of our political beliefs or even our analysis, which this was, it wasn't even that fiery of a belief, then we're screwed. So at that point, I started looking for a different place to publish a book.
And it's interesting to think, you know, right now we're talking politics, but maybe something that would connect to Missoulians, Montanans in general. You know, one example that really hits home is, let's just look at Norman Maclean's A River Runs Through It. I mean, this is one of the most important novellas that come out of Montana. Remember when that was pitched to New York? I mean, it was rejected and real snobbily. I mean, I think you know it better. What did they say? Something like it has trees.
That story has trees in it, and so therefore we can't publish his story. And my story, that this story about American music that I've written, have a lot of whole bums and ne'er-do-wells and all sorts of con men and medicine show performers and carnies and things like that in it, which were the people who gave us American music in its form. And I could see going to a commercial publisher with this and say, well, yeah, this is a good idea, but why don't you write more about celebrities? Because celebrities are what sell books these days, not ideas or not ordinary people. And I was and folk music is that way as well. It's music that achieved its most creativity and its richness when it was under the radar of the commercial establishment in some way, because commercial the commerce eventually corrupts things like creativity, and that's what happened with folk music. In fact, it's one of the stories I document in the book. And I just didn't want to do a parallel process when I was writing about this music because it was too dear to me for that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think the other interesting thing is as you touched on a little earlier, you said that from the time you start writing the book 5 years ago, it's actually more relevant today, as in literally today, right now, than it was 5 years ago. With everything that's going on in this country, our ongoing questions about race and race relations. Do you maybe want to just touch on that just a little bit?
Yeah, and it's interesting that when I started writing out, I had some confidence that that would be true, oddly enough. I mean, I couldn't forecast the future. Nobody could forecast the place we are right
Sure.
now, but we certainly trended in that direction. And the kind of virtual world that we're coming to embrace and live in is dehumanizing. And it's that dehumanizing factor that is creating so many problems for us, not just in our politics, but in our personal lives. And this is very much about our personal lives as well as our public lives. And as I thought about those two things, I thought, people throughout 50,000 years of human history, and that's literally true. We've been making music for 50,000 years, much longer than we've been writing books. People have turned to that in the worst times, the worst possible times. There's some research, for instance, and I talk about this in the book, that the Greeks used it as a healing process when so many wars were killing so many people in their world. That's how they dealt with the trauma of their time. That's how we evolved music. And so when I saw the upheaval coming and I saw people surrendering to the virtual world and doing things like listening to music on iPods as opposed to out of 50-year-old wonderful acoustic guitars, then I said, we're in trouble. And that trouble is only going to continue. And so this book will become more relevant as it goes. And it did.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. The other thing I really like and that I can appreciate about this book is that you do not take an academic approach to all of this. So some of what we've talked about might sound kind of dry to the listener right now. They might say, oh, okay, politics, human history, on and on. But what I appreciate is that you almost take, I'm not going to say an anti-academic approach because that's not true, but you weren't willing to just repeat kind of these tired tropes, right? And these tired cliches. You actually dug a lot deeper. Again, maybe New York is not going to be interested in that because you did take a different way. And I'm just wondering, it kind of seems like maybe this has been a theme your entire life, that has, well, it cost you a job at one point. Um, but here you are today. You've broken all the rules and you're still breaking the rules, and you're still here. Can you kind of maybe just briefly speak to that for, today's writers who are trying to be safe, trying to play by the rules, trying to kind of cozy up to New York?
Yeah, this is a realization that's been in MFA programs forever, come on, you're trying to write without having lived a life. Go out and live life a little bit. Don't talk to your professors all day because you're not going to have anything to say. And so you could replicate this in what I did. And you're right, in everything I do. And yeah, anti-academic is probably a bit strong, but only a bit. And there are days when I'm anti-academic. It's just quiet. I'm tired of all the navel gazing and the hand wringing over these issues. When in fact, music is something that you can get without intellectualizing it. You're supposed to be able to get it without intellectualizing. That's the beauty of it. It communicates us to in fundamental ways that are beyond words. And so one of the quotes I use in the book, and I've tried to trace this down as much as I could, and most people attribute it to Elvis Costello, but there's some doubt about that. But at any rate, what he is supposed to have said was, writing about music is like dancing about architecture. And I took that very seriously. And nonetheless, I'm writing a book, so I got to do this one way or another. But at least I could ignore the usual academic work, which is and I didn't ignore it. It's very rich in American music. I mean, people have been studying American music for 100 years and have done a very good job of it, but they missed a dimension of it in some ways by not living with it. And I've been playing music like this since I was in my 30s. I started late in life, and I've become a lot more involved in the last few years. And the dirty little secret of this is because I enjoy it. I just have a good time, and I meet more interesting people when I'm playing music than any other place I go, including in academic circles. The people are more engaged, they're better read, we have better conversations. And so I took that very seriously and just spent some time getting some dirt under my fingernails, but actually calluses on my fingers from playing guitar a lot. And if you just shut up and listen to what's going on around you with the music, then certain things begin to speak to you after a while. I got early on in the process, I met a pretty famous guy, a pretty famous musicologist named Alan Jabor. He was the head of the Library of Congress's Folk Life Project. So he collected the folk music. He was the replacement for Alan Lomax. And he talked to me about early on in his career in the 70s. He would go to these hillbilly musicians in Appalachia with a pad in his hand and ask them questions. And he said, he found I had got no answers. He couldn't figure anything else. So he finally took his violin, and he was a violin player, and he had to call himself a fiddle player now. But nonetheless, he sat down and played with them. And that's when he learned about those people, when he played music with them as opposed to asking them questions. So I took that very seriously, and I tried to listen to music more than I read books.
Well, is there anything else you want to leave us with?
Well, yeah, I want to summarize a little bit about the book, which is, it very quickly took me on two paths. And those will be clear to the reader as they go there. I was interested in music because it gave me access. And initially I said access to the American story in a way that is not possible by simply reading history. And in many ways we're talking about here.
Sure.
And that's exactly true. And that turned out to be true. And I think we can develop a very rich American history that tells us more about who we are as Americans than just the history books do. And there's a lot of pain and exploitation and things like that in that story, but there's a lot of really fine moments in that story too. But the other access that I didn't quite expect, and it really got teased into it in some of my research, was internal access. And that as you engage in the discipline of music, and it really is discipline, it's when musicians say they practice, we should take that word very much like Buddhists say they practice, right? That you are practicing music the way you practice meditation, and you're doing so to train your brain to go someplace else that's not available to normal people. And it's not just when you're playing music that effect is with you in your life, and it changes your life in very important ways. And I explored that in a lot of different levels in neuroscience, stuff like that, and thought a lot about it. But I think that's an important aspect of the book. So I ended up saying music saves your life in a couple ways, and that's it. That it tells us the large external story about ourselves, but it tells us the internal story about ourselves. And when you can harmonize those two things, you can get along a little bit better in this life.
Sure, sure. The last thing I actually want to say, you just reminded me of something about that with music. It's almost like an oral history, right? I mean, listening to music, listening to these musicians, it's really an oral history. And recently, the sociologist James Lowen, he was the author of the book Lies My Teacher Told Me. It's the best-selling history book in print today. And recently he said he has kind of come around to saying that oral history might be more accurate than written history when we're dealing with shameful acts, right? And so one of the examples he gives, he says, we all know that Major League Baseball was segregated. Blacks were not allowed to play until Jackie Robinson. We all know that. That's fact. You cannot find a single written document saying that. So if we rely on the written document, then that means it never happened. But we know that's untrue.
That's right.
And so your exploration of American history, again, we're not talking about the official documented history, but your history, to me, it's a bit more vibrant, it's more honest, and actually it reveals much more deeply who we are as a country, which I think is very important right now to understand.
Yeah, that's a vital point that you make, and it is in fact an oral history, and that is in fact what drew me to it to begin with. And I came away really reinforced in that belief that what you say is exactly true, that we cannot tell the fundamental history of our country, especially things like slavery, without understanding American music, because it's encoded there in ways. And give you an example, a song I always sing, and one of the first songs I ever learned was called Cocaine Blues. And it came from the 60s, and everybody in the 60s would play it because, of course, they were all druggies in the 60s, and that's what people played. Well, the first version of that was recorded in something like 1917. And people were addicted to cocaine in the American South because the plantation owners would give it to sharecroppers to make them work faster. And people were addicted to cocaine after they came back from World War I. And before that, people were addicted to morphine as a result of the Civil War. So there's another fiddle tune called Soldier's Joy, which is about morphine. And people were singing fiddle tunes and dancing to morphine songs in the 19th century. That tells you won't find that in the history books, but it's relevant. It's completely irrelevant. That's just one small example that you see over and over again in American folk music.
Well, I think we're hitting our half-hour mark here, just about. So we better wrap things up. Any last words?
Well, no, but thanks for joining me, Joey. It's not often I get an editor here to berate me in public a little bit, so this is kind of fun.
Hey, I only had about an hour warning. Otherwise, I would have made it much more painful. And everybody, remember, this is the book we're talking about right now. If it sounds good, it is good. You can find it again at Fact and Fiction. You order off their website, or you can order off the PM Press website, pmpress.org. Over to you, Lauren.
Yeah, thank you, Richard and Joey, so much for being in conversation with us today. For those of you who are watching this video, like Joey said, you can purchase Richard's book online at factandfictionbooks.com. You can purchase Montana Book Festival merchandise at montanabookfestival.com. And there you can also donate to make sure programming like this can continue into the fall. Thank you so much for joining us.